Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Hopkins, and welcome to the Self-Reg Show. This is the podcast with Stuart Shanker, where we focus on all things self-reg, which is truly his life's work. There's an awful lot to it, an awful lot of stories to tell, some science to explore, and all kinds of chances to think about, how do we take this science and apply it to being human beings, being educators, being parents, being in schools, being in the early years. And I'm really convinced it's become my life's work for the last 8, 9 years now. And it will be, because I'm convinced it truly is the game changer that we need for our world right now. So welcome, Stuart Shanker.
Good morning, Susan.
How are you today?
I'm actually pretty good.
You're in a different room than we usually film. I love seeing the light coming through your upstairs. Those skylights are lovely.
And I'm watching the fog rolling in over the lake.
I was lucky enough to see Stuart, and I say lucky because we used to see each other once a week when I would truck my way out to his place, and we would do some filming for various courses with the MEHRIT Centre. And COVID disrupted that, so I don't see him as much. I feel like I do because of online, but I don't see him as often anymore. And I got a chance to pass on through and see his new digs and all the windows and all your beautiful plants that you've been growing like crazy.
Yep.
you know, COVID brings new hobbies into our lives, doesn't it?
Yes.
So this show is brought to you by the MEHRIT Centre. So that's the organization that Stuart founded. He's the visionary, and I'm the one that runs it. But there are many players involved, many people that are part of the team and part of the self-reg community. And this podcast wouldn't happen without all of them. And in part, it is for our community, the people that learn a little bit of self-reg, learn a little bit of the science, begin to think about how to apply it, and are always clamoring for more. But it's also for folks who may not know any of that, may not know even what self-reg is, and be trying to address some of the challenges that they're facing in their professional work, working with children and youth, or in their families. And often what we find is we end up begin to think about how it affects ourselves as well, because self-reg truly is for everyone. So I want to start today, Stuart, with a story,
Okay.
and it's something that an early childhood educator said to me last week, and it keeps staying with me and ringing back in my mind's eye, because I don't know, there was something about the questions that she asked and the statements that she made that I really I don't know. I felt there's more self-reg that we can bring into it. I think that it was such an important statement, but it also gives me a chance to tell you just how important early childhood educators are here in our home province in Canada of Ontario, but across Canada, across the world. I mean, if we already knew, you've been advocating, me too. That's how we actually met through early childhood work. Been advocating for early childhood, not just the importance of it, but the people who do the work for a long time.
Yep.
And more people are getting that message, and so it gives me a chance to celebrate that, because she came up afterwards. I was doing this talk, and it was I don't know, there were about 150 people in the audience, and most of them were early childhood educators. And I only had about 75 minutes, so it wasn't a very long time. But she came up afterwards, as people will often do. They'll come up and you often ask you a question. And she said, "I got three things to tell you." She was very, straightforward about it. She said the first one is, she said, "I've been doing this work for almost 23 years. And I love kids. I love what I do. And the last 2 years have been the hardest 2 years of my life, of my profession." And she said, "Thank you for honoring that and validating that today." She said, "But I need you to tell everybody the
That-
message,
That's
you
really
know, and so that was one. So before I tell Stuart the second thing that she said to me, for those of you, I know some of you are just on the audio. For those of you on the video version, watching this through our YouTube channel, it's like playing a little game of what's changed in Susan's background. Did you notice? Yeah. So it's my dog Sophie. So she is now in the background. She is on her in her place. But we clearly paused and had to continue on. So anyway, glad to have Sophie part of it. So the second thing she said to me, Stuart, was that she really appreciated learning about stress, a little bit about the science of stress. She said that she has learned some things about self-regulation. Early childhood educators have been many teachers don't know this, but they've been learning self-regulation is in their courses for decades now.
Yeah.
Now, there's different definitions of self-regulation, and it may not be exactly the ones that we're working with, but some element of it, they've been talking about it for a long time. It's in their training. But she said, I thought I understood stress. And I'm now thinking about it completely differently.
That's
Okay.
interesting.
Which was, and then she wants to learn more. But the big thing for me was the her eyes light up when she said that. She said, I needed some hope
Yeah,
because I've been doing this for a long time and I'm tired and I keep thinking, is it time to leave the profession or
that's interesting too.
and that's not what we want, right? She also said that we don't laugh as much as we used to, which really stayed with me. She said we used to laugh, that children used to laugh more. We're not laughing as much. So, that really kind of stayed with me because not just the fact that that is the problem, but that really understanding what stress is, which we talked about in our last podcast. And so for those of you that haven't seen or heard that one, go back to the last podcast because Stuart did a great job of unpacking that last time. But she said that it was hope because all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're not saying the same old thing, right? There's something new I can learn here. Anyway, and she felt very good about that. But the third one really stayed with me. She said, okay, so now, let's get to the nuts and bolts of it, which we hear, right? Show me the strategy. Is sort of something that can often be asked. And we have that saying, you are the strategy, which, there's it's not just head knowledge, and it's not just some skills. Some skills are part of it for sure. But we've got to feel it in that we call it heart knowledge, but it's really an embodied understanding of this. Recognizing ourselves in the mix is part of the journey. But she said, so I understand from just a couple of things you said that this child who's showing up to my center every day, and arrives, and we already know it's going to be a day. That child walks in, and sometimes it's obvious because they're fighting with parent or whatever. Sometimes it's not. You just already know it's going to be a day. And there is a predictable tantrum that's happening almost every day. And that, sometimes this kid has to go home. We're supposed to be doing inclusion, but we don't have the skill set. And like, I know this is a huge question and we can't unpack it in a podcast. Folks that, really want to dive deep into this kind of stuff. Our early childhood course is terrific. And, really gives you a chance to unpack it. But her question was very valid. She's like, so I got an inkling from what you shared that there really is no such thing as a tantrum. And she said, helpful. And it's like, where do I even start? So okay, I can get that it's not it's not a real thing. I can get the idea that okay, it's an external thing I'm seeing, right? But what do I do? Where do I start? And I just thought it was a really good question of it because we want to help people. How do we help people, and where do we start? So I wanted to open with that and see, what you think. Yeah, I know.
Well, I wanted to start with a story as well. And the two stories mesh pretty well. So maybe my story will start us off in answering your story. Uh, I noticed I wanted to do something kind of seasonal. Today is November 24th that we're taping this. I'm not entirely sure when Adam's going to air this, but it'll be pretty close to Christmas. And I noticed something very puzzling, with my own kids at Christmas. And that was every single Christmas I knew that there was going to be a blow up. There was going to be tantrums. There was going to be meltdowns. I knew that there would be chaos. This started when they were very young. And if anything, it got worse. So one year, I'm watching all this and I'm thinking, I thought to myself, geez, I'm doing all this work at Mary. Surely we as a team, the Mary team, can come up with some explanation of why this is happening and what I can do to finally have a nice Christmas, if that's conceivable.
Yeah.
So I already knew that, there's a lot of research telling, I should just add that my older boy has autism and my younger boy has pretty severe ADHD. So I knew that for both, populations, if you like, getting a gift is a stress. And Susan and I had a nice talk in our last podcast about how stress is anything that burns energy, essentially. But that struck me as being, way too simple an answer of what was going on here. Sort of like, well, maybe the secret to having a nice Christmas is not to have presents. Um, and that wasn't going to fly. And so I had a full team meeting. And we had a fairly large team at Mary at our research institute at York. And I put the question to them. I want to have a list of the major stresses that affect children, that require kids to burn energy. I'm not sure what I was expecting, maybe a couple dozen stresses. And they just kept on coming back with more
Yeah.
and more. And eventually I said, we got to stop. We stopped at 650.
That's a lot of stress.
It's a lot and not very helpful
Yeah.
because my goal was, I was looking at, tools that would help parents. Something, say, at Christmas time that would, enable parents to have that sort of joyous celebration that we all want, full of peace and calm, which only seems to occur on a Hallmark movie. So giving parents a list of 650 stresses is a stress in itself. When you're going down through the list and you're ticking off boxes. And I did that myself. I was doing that, trying to figure out um, uh, what were the major stresses involved with my own children. And I knew that this wasn't very helpful. I ended up ticking easily half of my 650, and I probably could have ticked them all. So we did. I got Devin to do something which, in psychology, it's called a factor analysis. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to uh, group similar stresses so that we could reduce the number of things that parents had to think about. And eventually, he came up with 5 groups of this list of 650. And what I mean by that is that these would be, we could stick, say, 50 of the stresses in what we called the physical domain. Physical stresses, like Susan and I looked at last podcast. So, things like noise and lights and stuff like that. And we ended up with 5 groupings, which became in TMC became the 5 domains of stress: physical, emotion, cognitive, social, and prosocial. And it became clear to me, right from the start, that at Christmas, on Christmas Day, all 5 of those domains were involved. It wasn't simply the stress of getting a present. And I should add, we were my wife was unbelievably careful about, finding out what they really wanted and getting them the things they wanted. Um, and I'm sure, like me, most of you experienced, that manic tearing off the wrapper, having absolute delight with the present, which lasted for about a half an hour before the present broke,
Yeah.
and then chaos shortly afterwards arising. So we noticed something as a team. We noticed something really interesting about our 5 domains. The first, well, we noticed several things. First, it was never just one domain. So there was one thing that jumped out at you. But let me stick with our example here. With my kids, it was a nightmare getting them to sleep the night before Christmas. It was a nightmare getting them to stay asleep on Christmas Day. So to begin with, they were exhausted. And then we had this terrible, custom where they got to make their own breakfast. Uh, that is not to be repeated. Breakfast was every conceivable form of sugar. And so, we started adding up all of the physical stresses, but there were others. Okay. So we've got the emotion stress of excitement, uh, maybe disappointment. We've got the physical stresses, there were multiple. We've got the cognitive stresses that were involved, their expectations, their, uh, what we found with the kid was those expectations always outstripped reality, and so on and so on. So, and all the stresses that had been going on leading up to Christmas, the stresses that they were experiencing at school around this, and it soon became clear to us that what we were looking at were multiple drains on the child's energy. And so the tantrum is really, I love the third point you made in your story. The tantrum is really, it comes, we won't do it today, but it comes from very deep inside the brain. And it's basically a sign that this kid is running on empty, that the fuel's been used up. But then we noticed something even more interesting, and I'm talking about the team now. We were working with what's called a dynamic systems model in all of our research. And what we noticed was that there are dynamic relationships or connections between the various stresses. Now, let me just explain in English what that means for a parent. Um, so obviously, it means that if the kid is, say, tired, or tired maybe in a sleepy sense, or maybe just, in that sort of low energy, high tension state, it means that there is likely going to be, that trigger for emotion stress, for getting too excited or for getting disappointed. But to say it's dynamic tells us something very interesting, and that is the one stress changes the threshold for a stress response in a different domain. That's what we mean when we talk about this being a dynamic connection or a dynamic relation. So I can give a really easy example of this. Um, uh, Another mistake that we would make is um, Christmas lunch or Christmas dinner was always a social affair. And so with
Mhm.
family or friends. So now we've got social stress added into the mix. But because of the other stress loads, because of the low energy state, this lowers the threshold for the amount of social stress that you can experience without having a meltdown. Stress thresholds change. Stress itself is we didn't mention this last week, but we think of in TMC, we think of stress as a dynamic concept. Um, the extent to which something is stressful is as much a function of your internal state as the stimulus. So when I'm really tired, I absolutely hate social events. I
Mhm.
find the noise too much. I find the crowds too much. I find small talk is but when I'm in a sort of supercharged energy state, I adore social interactions. I find them energizing. So I'm just going to pause for 1 second. I've got two more points to make here, but what I'm trying to explain is why the 5 domain model um, is such a is such a an eye opener for parents as we start. We think, well, this was the stress. This is the obvious stress. I got the wrong color sweater, whatever. But in fact, there's multiple things that have lowered the threshold for that emotion stress outbreak.
So I love everything you've just shared, and it's interesting. You and I share that about
Yes, we do.
social. In our team knows because
Yes, they
we
do.
do get-togethers, especially after our annual summer symposium, which we're back to face this year. Yay! We usually come to my place and have a barbecue or what have you, and we love it.
But,
I do.
but
There's so many wonderful moments and memories. Like I still remember our first Self-Reg baby, which was one of our team
yes,
members. Steven's
see you, Cynthia.
Steven's son. Yeah, and it's just
I
really
do too.
thinking about these connections, but they can be real. I find small talk actually very difficult. I can talk about kids or self-reg, or these days it's gardening or animals, or the state. I can talk about those things forever to anybody,
Hang on. Gardening is small talk.
well, you know what though? I do find it
Oh,
challenging
I'd love
sometimes.
talking gardening with you.
Yeah, I know, and so it really resonates. But I just want to take a moment and a pause, and I'm going to I wanted to give an in the moment experience of the 5 domains and answer a few questions that some of you may have had just by what you heard from Stuart, okay, or some of the things you may have noticed. So when I think about the biological stressors, when that you're experiencing right now, like how are you hearing our sound? What are you seeing in the
That's a good one.
video?
That's very good.
I know that our producer Adam is like sound levels and these sorts of things, right? An emotion stressor. Did you feel frustration that Stuart didn't directly dive in? Just an example. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but didn't drive right in and answer the question about a tantrum, right? The cognitive stressor. So we do this to people all the time with our acronyms. What does he mean by that? What does he mean by that? So I'm just going to tell you, Mary was a research institute at York University, and it's an acronym, and it really laid the groundwork for the organization TMC, which stands for the MEHRIT Centre. And I'm also going to, I'm sure Devin was the lead scientist there. So we should link, we'll have Adam link one of my favorite papers you did with Devin, which we'll get to down the road, but is reducing the effort and
Reducing
effortful
the effort.
control, which is just a terrific paper. I may not have touched all the things that you had cognitive stress or what does he mean? What does he mean? But noticing that, right? So the social stressor, I guess you could think about, how you related to what we just shared about social. Maybe you're watching this with a group of others. There could be some social pieces to that, but the pro-social stressor is one that I absolutely want to jump in at. So if you heard Stuart start his story around Christmas, and Christmas is not something you celebrate, or practice, that can feel like a pro-social stress and injustice. You're not
Yeah.
included. It can actually make us feel separated. And it's important for you to know that it's an example. It could be any of the celebrations, and Stuart himself is Jewish, right? So what we're thinking of is when we use that, it's a really important example. I celebrate in my family, but I can also think of a exact example of going to a birthday party and watching two-year-olds. They were toddlers. When the presents went to be opened, it was a birthday party for a 3-year-old, and there were 2 to 10-year-old kind of kids there. they got into a full on fist fight when the presents were being opened, right? So you can apply it to anything in your life. So just a chance to kind of play with those
Yeah.
five domains of stress, and then to flip it back to you, Stuart.
Uh, I realized yesterday I sent a message to some of the members of the team, and I used the expression "todo Kylo," and I didn't realize I was stressing everybody out. Um, and Susan made fun of it. Um,
I have a joke that lots of messages, Stuart, and it's true. It's not actually not true, but I actually do it. I share it to reduce other people's stress, so they realize I don't know what he means either. So I get off to Google I go, right?
okay, so I'm going to apologize to everybody in advance of this podcast series. I was thinking, you can take the boy out of Oxford, but you can't take Oxford out of the boy.
That's where the rest of us come in.
Okay, so I want to make two more points about these five domains. And the next point is there's a whole chapter on this in the 2016 book, Self-Reg. It's really one of my favorite stories. It's stuck with me, and I'm not going to repeat the story now. You got to go read the book. But it's the story of the mom whose daughter had asked for a pink hoodie, and mom had bought a gray one because that's all they had left. And there was a huge blow up. And then the next morning, after the mom had done self-reg the evening before, the next morning, the kid came downstairs wearing the gray hoodie, and really feeling deep affection for what mom had done for her. And the point of that story, and the point I want to make now is, don't assume that you know what the major stressor is. Um, Quite often, what we find is that as we start to delve into, say, the physical domain, um, or the cognitive, um, that that was actually the major issue, and it lowered the threshold for what we thought, for what was so glaring, for what the fight was about, we'll say. But Susan's example just now, the little guys having a fist fight. I'm pretty sure that Susan's talking about a birthday party that we had given our kids. Uh, we also had the fist fight. Um, but of course, and you could jump into the assumption that, well, it was they were jealous, or they were exercising dominance or whatever. But in fact, what it really was all the physical stresses that were going on at the party. And that's a real that's a real important lead in for the last point. And that is, you've got these five domains. And what happens is the kid gets caught, or we get caught, in what we call a stress cycle. The stresses start bouncing around, influencing each other, causing stress reactions to grow. And in fact, we can explain all this in terms of the neurochemicals that are happening. And I just want to spend 1 second on that because we did it last week. Remember, stress is anything that requires us to burn energy to stay in balance. When you get caught in a stress cycle, you start producing more and more neurochemicals that make you kind of crazy or irrational. So what's happening is your brain's responding to this lower stress state, this lower energy state, by producing what are called catecholamines. And these give us surges of adrenaline, surges of something called norepinephrine, or surges of dopamine. And the chemicals take over. And so if I've got a child now that's caught in a stress cycle where their brain and their circulatory system are just suffused with these, what are essentially survival neurochemicals, The last thing that I can do is say, well, let's all have a time out. We're going to just calm down. You go to your rooms. The problem is that if you try that, and by the way, we did try this. This is
Hmm.
in my very, very early days, sending them to their room for, take one of your toys, go to your room for 15, 20 minutes to calm down. But it's a very interesting problem. And this is a really important one for us. On their own, a kid can't reduce those neurochemicals. They still keep circulating through the system. And so when they come back out, or you think, well, now maybe we can have a nice lunch together, they're still full of all these jangly neurochemicals. And so we haven't done anything to turn them off. So how do we turn them off? Well, that's what we were doing last podcast. We turn it off with stroking and a cuddle and using our voice, all these ways that trigger the chemicals that turn off the ones that are making our child go into a tantrum. So what did we do in terms of Christmas? What did we actually learn from this? Well, we learned a couple of things. Number one, we had to reduce the stresses that we could. And we looked at all 5 domains, and we were really, really careful now. Careful about sleep, careful about breakfast, careful about not overwhelming them with presents.
Hmm.
It seems like such a nice thing to do, but in fact, it's a stress. Um, and then making sure that we had, so we started a new game. And the new game was, this is when they were little, who can give the best hug? And the winner would get a prize. But what we were really doing was, uh, getting that uh, they're called they're skin receptors that trigger the good chemicals. And I would take advantage of this and rub the back and do all those things. And what the reason I mention it is, to this day, so I got a 21-year-old son and an 18-year-old son. And to this day, on Christmas Day, they will ask me after we've gone through the present opening, when are we going to play the hug game? Okay, so what we want, so we need to bring in these, we need new routines that through Self-Reg we understand are going to trigger the counter stress response. It's not enough to say to just reduce the stresses. We've also to got to trigger, activate the neurons that calm the nervous system down. And you know what? They learn it. And they learned it. Our kids learned it by the time they were teens. Um, didn't always practice it and still don't practice it, but it's there. The knowledge is there, and it'll come back when they need it.
There's so much in there. I think one of the things I want to emphasize is a point that you made that I've never heard you quite. You probably have, and I just didn't really jump onto it as much as I will now going forward. I always learn something new with you, Stuart. But really talking about, when we send children away for whatever reason, or they're by themselves, that they can't reduce the neurochemicals. That's different than saying dial down the stress or find their calm. It's like that brings it to life. Like, no, you're actually trying. Sometimes I think about trying to reduce the heart rate, like turn the knob. It's more
Yeah.
complicated than that, right? And remember that quiet is not the same as genuine calm. So that's a really important one for us.
Can I say something to that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what you just said is huge. So what Susan just said was turn down the heart rate. That's exactly right. That's what we want to do. But it raises a really interesting question. What turns down the heart rate? Well, we know the answer to that. So if you've done a little bit of self-reg with us, you know that it's the parasympathetic system. It's a chemical called acetylcholine. And what that does is it turns down the heart rate. It turns down breathing rate. It turns down blood pressure. But here's the interesting thing. When you get older, you can do this on your own. When you get older, you can learn how to you can learn how to activate these neurochemicals like acetylcholine, um, or oxytocin. You can learn how to do this through meditation or listening to music. Kids can't, right? It's just a kid. But what they can do, so the interbrain, which we haven't really talked about very much, was designed for us to trigger those things that dial down the heart. And pretty soon, as they get older, we're hoping they're going to learn how to do it for themselves. But in the beginning, they can't. It's a great metaphor, that dialing down the heart.
And so the inner brain is us, right? It's the relationships. And so
Yes.
that kid from the original question that I got about the tantrum, even if we just sort of think about what Stuart has just shared. So, and we use I like the term behaviors communication, but I'm very worried about it because it's so overused and it's become it actually is used in different ways where it becomes a behavior strategy or whatever, and that's not really what it is in Self-Reg. It's saying why and why now, but you have to know there is always more to understand. And yet, very much like Stuart shared in the beginning, it's not like this is not just for the clinical people. I'm not a clinician. This is for all of us. And that it's not that we need to know every single stressor. It's not even possible. Stress is not the enemy here. It's too much stress. And when we see the signs of it bursting out in behavior, it's explosive, but it can be inward too. The shutting down, we get a teenager with the hoodie, the, grumbly stuff, right? That those are all something for us to go, why and why now? And then we try to think about what we know and what we notice, and it is very much an awareness. It is a skill set. You learn, if you're like, I don't know how to learn this, you got to keep engaging. Courses for me are the best way, but Stuart, the books are a big help. We have a new Stuart's last book that he just mentioned, the 2016 parenting book in French right now. So, they're definitely a point of entry. Participating in podcasts, they're always, but it does come. And it's just one day you notice we have a lot of self-breakers say once you see it, you can't unsee it. So it begins to be infused in everything you do and everything you see. Does that mean you always get it right? And I wanted to share this example from last night for any of you who are like, oh my God, I can't do this, or where do I start? So this is me, a decade into learning with Stuart. 2.5 decades in education. I know a fair bit, and like most days, I wake up and realize the more I know, the less I know. There's always more to understand, but I know a lot of self-reg. I'm pretty good at this. I've actually, been doing it with my daughter most of her life in some kind of way, and in fact, on the holidays come around, for my own stress, to be honest with you, I insist and I don't even have to do it anymore. It's just part of what we do, that it's on Christmas morning, but it could be any holiday morning, that I insist that the people that are part of that, we open one at a time. We take our time.
Smart.
We clean up as we go.
Smart.
And it's so much nicer, right? And
This
it's
is it.
not just the quiet, it's honoring that somebody put energy into whatever that gift was. So,
Yeah, it's great. I love it.
and if you're saying my house is a free for all, you can reset that. You can disrupt stuff and say, okay, start talking about it now, though, and rewrite that narrative. So I do all of those things. I do lots of stuff right. yesterday. So I know we started with early years, but this applies to parenting. It applies to teaching. It applies to just about anything. I want you to know that this compassion and this message you're hearing from Stuart doesn't mean bubble wrapping, and it's not no boundaries and no accountability. No, because believe it or not, that's a stress around kids, right? It's that predictable, that they can count. There are so many reasons why those things are important. And when our kids get older, like both Sue and I with our teenagers have tried to figure out, where our role is, and it is dynamic, and it's, we want to be part of our kids' lives, but encourage independence, because independence is really important. Well, yesterday I had a variety of stressors that are accumulating. I'm going through parenting a teen, which is a big learning curve for me, and mostly, doing okay. But there's been some very hard moments, very hard ones, and trying to find my way through. And Self-Reg has really been my GPS, right? It's helped me figure out how to respond, but I have to. There's no easy answers. I didn't go and buy a book and it told me what to do. I had to take what I learned and apply it, and learn some things the hard way. But yesterday, I've been feeling this real sense of injustice around being a taxi service. And in fairness to my daughter, we don't live that far away from others, but it is 2 kilometers, and there is no easy, well lit sidewalks to get here. So there is a very dark part of town with woods and all those things. So it's not as easy as saying I walked when so I do a little bit. I really wanted my daughter. I wanted to be part of her life in the teenage years because I didn't have that, and I think that it's important, and I know the research says it is, and trying to navigate that. But I feel a sense of injustice every time I'm kept waiting. I pay for the phone so that I can reach you. This kind of stuff, and I, even as you see my face, it's like that self control, but it's
Yeah,
real.
everybody on this is going.
It's real, right? And I'm always trying to like manage my own state and notice it and remember, all those kinds of things. And it's not that I have no boundaries or no rules, and it's not that I don't ever talk. But I pick my moments. I don't do it in the heat of a moment, but there's a lot, Sienna calls them pep talks. I think I told you last time. They're not pep talks from my perspective. They're really trying to sort of lay the groundwork. And like it drives me a little bit bonkers. So yesterday I had to pick her up. I had laid all the, a million times, and I can't reach her, and then I get a last minute request, and can you drive this person home or whatever? And she had to be home for dinner, and then she horseback rides once a week, which I'm really, it's expensive, and I'm trying to keep her in because trying to keep those good things in her life, right? But I navigated a lot. Anyway, so I get her home, and then I get her to riding with like 4 seconds to spare. Okay. And so you can imagine I've worked all day, blah, blah, blah. And I come home, and so some of you are going to be shocked when I tell you what I did, but I just want to say this is about being human, and that I've laid the groundwork with Sienna since she was little, because I know just from prior work, I know a lot about how to create safety around kids online, and some of the things you do from the young age. And I have a personal situation that happened to a friend of mine's niece that I know very well, that was very, very tragic, and it's always stayed with me. About kids being online without supervision. So since Sienna has been little, like little, I have told her I will be, I'll be looking over your shoulder. Sometimes I will even go in and look at things. I will try to not respect your privacy, but I'm doing it out of love. And so it's harder in the teenage years, of course, but I still do that, and I still do it occasionally, and she's okay with it. I don't suggest you start this with your child if they're 14 and you have never introduced this before. But I also don't suggest you don't do it behind them, because that creates a mistrust. So anyway, I came home last night, and I was convinced I had negative bias in my mind, all these bad things, and there are things I'm navigating, like keeping her in classes and all that kind of stuff. So I dropped her off. She had left her phone at home to charge, and so I went in to have a look, and I had these suspicions of these things selling stuff on like I just had these suspicions, and I went in and I found zilch, and I had to sit down and go, okay, Susan, right? There is what gets apparent to that point where we're like, right? And it wasn't. I'm actually in a fairly good place overall. I've been working on my Self-Reg and my own well-being quite intensely, especially step 5, the restoration, which I more than just stress management, and it's making a difference. So I actually recovered from it quite quickly. But what gets me in that state of assuming the worst of it, expecting negative things, and it was a real shift for me. It was a real shift for me. And guess what happened when I picked her up? It was the sienna that I had been kind of trying to seek all along. So I just wanted to share that because this is about being a real human, and in retrospect, I wish I hadn't have done that. And even if I've laid the groundwork to let her know I do that from time to time, it's usually with her. And how did I get to that moment yesterday in that particular time? It's because this is us too, and a timeout was not what I needed. What I needed was some moments to reflect and then a chance to reconnect, because that was what I was missing, was the connection with her. Can you relate, Stuart?
Well, I think we all do.
Yeah,
I was going to say to you at one point, you know, I was so excited when they got their licenses. I thought I don't have to be the taxi service anymore.
yeah,
So my 18-year-old, my older boy, he said he was going to, he wanted to take the car. He was going into town. He'd be back in about half an hour. So 4 hours later, we're trying to figure out. We're ready now to call the police. Actually, we were
worried.
convinced that he'd had an accident. Anyways, he shows up, and by this point we're in pretty bad shape. Where the hell were you? Oh well, we all decided that it would be fun to drive up to Bancroft.
Oh, that is a good drive.
Yeah, that's a good drive. And
Wow.
then, and then, so my wife sort of hits the roof, and then he says, "By the way, can I have $100 for gas? I left the tank empty, and I'm not sure that you've got enough left to even get to the gas station." Okay, so it doesn't get easier. But I loved Susan's story, and it was really a great wrap up for what we were trying to do with the five domains. And what her message was for all of us is these five domains are about you and me. They're not just
Yeah.
about our kids.
And
And maybe, Susan, in a future one, it would be good if we could talk a little bit about the interbrain. That might be something worth explaining.
I think that might be where we go next.
Okay.
And, I want you all to hear. So, how do I solve a tantrum? Tantrum is a label. It's a term that's applied. We tend to think of it for young children at a certain age, at 2 or 3. We call it a tantrum. It brings to mind a visual. You're in the middle of a big store and whatever it is. But that you could have easily called that an adult tantrum that I had last night. If you'd have
Yes,
been here and been able to see the stress chemicals through my brain and body, and you would have been a different Susan than maybe who you see most of the time.
or throwing,
Happens.
or throwing ketchup against the wall.
Absolutely. And it's like, why and why now? So where do you start? There's a lot to learn, and I wish it was as simple as giving you a blog or 10 tips. They can help, but there is more learning, to unlearn this way of thinking, this self-controlism, this, everything's a shoulda, coulda, woulda, and the individual. We've been marinating in it in our whole lives. Our culture has as
Yes.
well. And to unlearn it takes some time of being with others who are open, and beginning to explore this, validating for many people that are interested in this. It validates something that they feel but maybe weren't able to trust enough, their that inner kind of sense, and it's just more learning and thinking why and why now, recognizing it with those soft eyes, even in yourself, in that child. That behavior is not where I stay. When I see it, I'm like, oh wow. And I know that's been coming for a long time. Mine last night wasn't about last night, or at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, whenever it happened. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and 3, and what I could have done at noon, to right, instead of working straight through. And so there is hope. There are hows, and Self-Reg is your journey forward. So, Stuart, last word is yours.
I'm going to quote you. There is hope. So have a nice Christmas, everybody.
There's loads of hope. Thank you very much. And I just want to, before we close out, thank you all for participating. Please share our podcast with your friends or anyone who you think might be interested in it. There's all kinds of ways to share, as you can see in in the notes of wherever you're watching this. We also would love to have comments and questions, so please feel free to respond to those. And I want to thank the MEHRIT Centre for funding this, and our Adam Kemp, who is our producer and online here and behind the scenes for doing all the heavy lifting. So thank you all very much, and let's self-reg on, right? Happy self-regging to you, as we said last time. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye, everybody.